Hello, I'm John O'Brien. I'm Head of Communications with MCC Brussels. Today, welcome to another episode of Deep Dives. Deep Dives is the series where we take an in-depth look at the research, the analysis, the reports that we produce. I'm delighted to introduce you today to a new report, A Museum's Renaissance. This report was written by Katalin Deme, who's the Senior Research Fellow at MCC Brussels. Katalin, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, John. Thank you too.
The museum, from our childhood when our parents would take us, a school group we'd go with, or a youth club, a museum entered a whole world of possibilities for us as we delved into history, tradition, and culture. And people still, of all ages, enjoy the museum for those very reasons and seek out museums for those reasons. You, in your very first words in the report, tell us that the traditional museum is in crisis. And the museum definition, as ratified by the International Council of Museums in 2022, you said, declares that the purpose of museums is to foster diversity and sustainability. You suggested that traditional versus activist museums are now in conflict. Can you tell us a little bit about this report and how you came to that conclusion?
Thank you for this question, John. You know, your question brings me to a journey around my head and to a journey back 20, 30 years in my life. Because if you believe or not believe, I have been working with the issue of Jewish museums in the last 25, 30 years. And if I try to remember how it was in the 70s, in the 80s, in my childhood, in my youth, being in a museum, walking through a museum, the first image I see those glass monitors and some very lonely objects in these glass monitors.
Yes.
You know, and somehow they were lonely because the context was missing. So socialist museology, or I would say, if I want to be a more extreme or radical, Marxist-Leninist museology, was very object-oriented, less text-oriented, less context-oriented. And of course, the political system, and this is nothing new in history, nothing unusual, used history, used memory politics, used museums as museum institutions to legitimize the system itself. Mm-hmm. So this is nothing new. It was also so in the time of Napoleon. But because we, the society, although not the communists, but the majority maybe of the society, we knew that this political system is built on false premises, on false democracy, on false humanism. We all understood that the narrative or the missing narrative, or that the narrative was false. We knew that this is lie or partially a lie. So it was easy to differentiate the truth and the lie in the historical narrative. Mm-hmm. You could build your approach, you could build your opinion. It was fait accompli. It was there. And then when I walk further in time toward the 90s, from the 80s to the 90s, and I remember my first visits when the borders were open, and I first visited France. That was the big West for me, you know, the free country. And I visited museums there, and I was fascinated by this different way of building a museum narrative, of building a museum, of making exhibitions. And what fascinated me, I remember, I was mesmerized, really. There was the open narratives. These exhibitions I experienced at this time were multivocal. They were parallel voices, historical voices. So they were quite reflective. I really liked them. But that was my first reaction. And then a few years passed, and I had a greater museum experience with the West. And suddenly I felt that something is confusing me, or something is irritating me in these exhibitions.
Something had changed.
Something had changed, and I just tried to put words on it. And it was that I always heard, while I was walking through the exhibitions, a whispering voice, something as if there was an interpretation I should adapt, a voice telling me how to understand those exhibitions. And that was a new challenge, because as I told you, the socialist, the Marxist-Leninist museum exhibitions, they had a narrative, they had a finalized narrative, so you could like it, take it, or leave it. But there I saw something I really liked. It was fascinating. It was interesting. But somehow this whispering voice took my freedom of reflection.
What was the whispering voice? Is the whispering voice the idea of the introduction of some type of political or social agenda into the museum today?
It wasn't directly a political or a social agenda, but it was the agenda of those people who made the exhibition, actually the museum professionals, but it wasn't explicit. It wasn't explicit, and that was the difference. So I couldn't really, if I need to say now negatively, defend myself against certain type of narrative I couldn't agree upon, because it wasn't explicit in these exhibitions. But it was also challenging in a way. It made you think. It made you to make reflections. But as the years passed, and now I'm walking through the time toward the end of the 90s and the beginning of 2000, this whispering voice, it started to be stronger, and it almost covered my own reflections, and took the possibility from me to build up my own opinions in exhibitions.
That whispering voice that you heard, how much is that related to the International Council of Museums and their declaration to want, to foster diversity and sustainability is the purpose of the museum?
This is a very, very core question, a very good question, because the International Council of Museums put up a new museum definition in 2022. And this museum definition is against, actually the negation of the original museum idea. And what is the original museum idea? It is to present a narrative, whether about history or culture or science or other topics, by using rich historical sources, professionalism, and to serve it understandably and with entertainment, to make it interesting. But this museum definition from 2022, it uses 3 or 4 core words or expressions that museums, they need to foster inclusion, they need to foster diversity, and even sustainability.
Yeah. Now, let's go back to the traditional museum. How much of the traditional museum vision is rooted in historical fact, as you say, versus an idealized construction of the past? Can you address that for us?
It depends from the museum. Museum narratives always idealize the past, or did the opposite of it. They always served a political system, a power. So this is nothing new in history. But there was always a professionality. Museologists, museum professionals working, being educated in museology and museum sciences, working with these exhibitions. And so that was the most important part of it, that when you enter the museum, you were confronted with a professionally funded museum narrative. And even in communist or socialist museology, actually the socialist museology was very professional. It served also as a model for international museology. It was founded in the 1960s and 70s. So there was a methodology, there was a theoretical approach to museum science and to making exhibitions. But this turning point, when we speak about the ICOM's new museum definition, it caused that actually the museum's original purpose is now on the secondary place, and some layers, political layers and agendas is going up on this fundament. And I'm asking you or myself or the others who are listening to me, why should museums foster diversity in society or sustainability, which is even more absurd?
Well, then, to break that down, can knowledge remain neutral or value-free when museums are involved in shaping public perceptions about contemporary ethical values?
Knowledge is never neutral. It depends who serves this knowledge, who defines the knowledge. But museum visitors should have the freedom to define their own opinion, to make their own interpretations of the subject the museum is presenting them, and they shouldn't be mainstreamed towards, and on a psychological way, actually on an implicit way towards certain definitions, how to interpret the museum exhibition or the narrative.
So you think people are being told what to think? And when they listen to an audio recording, when they read a description, when they enter into a particular experience in a museum, a film or whatever, you think that they're being instructed about what they're seeing as opposed to being asked to observe neutral facts. Would that be?
If you allow me, I will go back to my own experiences, because I was specializing in my professional life on Jewish museums. Mm-hmm. Jewish museums are a very specific type of cultural, historical, sometimes ethnographical museums. And I remember in the time before the 1980s, socialist Jewish museums, they had a very special, they epitomized the socialist museology. They were very object-oriented, and all contests lacked in these museums about the history of Jewish communities, about the Holocaust. So they were turned to ethnographic museums. Now, just to turn back to your questions, what happened with those museums after the 1990s? Jewish museums started to be used as democratizing institutions. Mm-hmm. Jewish museums suddenly had the mission, or just they got the mission to spread humanistic ideas, to make societies around them more democratic, to fight against xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and now Jewish museums, they are even fighting against Islamophobia. They're fighting for LGBTQ rights. So they are telling people how to read, not just the museum also, but the society too.
So Jewish museums, basically, according to your argument, are being put to work around doing various tasks to influence people about certain things in certain ways. But could the democratization of museums lead to a more inclusive, representative form of cultural knowledge? Or does it undermine the intellectual rigor and authority that I think you suggest that it does do that in the report?
I am very against it as museum professional to endow museums, not just Jewish museums, but museums generally, with a task, to form, to shape society, to shape society's thoughts. I think we are mature, we are adult, and even children, they can build up their own opinion. So the museum is not there to educate, to shape society, to make society better. This is not the museum's task. Museum is there to present and represent their subject, to make people more clever, to entertain them, to give them the feeling when they leave the museum that they have learned something new and they can give it to their children, but not that they became better people or better citizens.
The report mentions that E. Goodien conceptualize museums as a safe space for unsafe ideas. How does this fit in the broader debate about whether museums should be politically neutral or politically engaged? Can this model of the museum accommodate both our controversial ideas and the ethical concerns that people have about social justice, or are the two of them incompatible?
The concept of safe place is very illusionary, because the basic idea was, well, come to the museum, build your opinion. You can have different political backgrounds or persuasions. No matter, you're free here. The museum is here for you. But the problem is that at the moment, you, for example, let's be concrete, you express more nationally grounded, patriotic, conservative thoughts. The safe place is not there for you. You are not place of this safe place. And I'm coming back again concerning the safe place phenomenon to a concrete example. It was in Berlin, in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. I guess it was in 1919, when the then director of the Jewish Museum, Peter Schäfer, he made an exhibition which somehow suggested that he supported the Boycott Israel movement, which was a great paradox, being the director of such an important Jewish institution, or institution about Jewish history. And it was a scandal which ended with his abdiction. He should leave his position. And the exhibition was replaced, and then the discussion blossomed up. What is a safe place, actually? Can you? I don't say I agree with him, but it shows just how vulnerable this phenomenon is.
Mm-hmm. How does the shift in museum focus from collection and curation to activism affect the responsibility for the preservation of cultural heritage? Is this something that's threatened?
This is a very personal question for me, because I see how tangible objects disappear from our civilization, from our everyday life, not their importance, not just from museums. And particularly museums, they are becoming much less collection-oriented. And the collection is the identity of the museum. And they have now additional tasks. But activism is coming into the museum picture when the collection is really degraded, the importance of the collection, and all those additional ideas of democratizing society, of making people better citizens, of making them more inclusive, more diverse, and so on, they win more the terrain. So I am pleading very much for museums to come back to their objects, to come back to their collections, because objects, they never lie. They have their own language, they have their own voice. You need to listen to them. And it leads me also to my experience at the museum here in Brussels. I was also writing about the Museum of European History, which is a modern kind of multimedia museum. The museum has a collection, but this is a restricted collection, and objects, they play a minor role in the exhibition. And I remember at my first visit, I saw a Greek vase there at the museum at the start of the exhibition, and I told myself, God, I have never seen such a lonely vase in my life. This vase was muted, was cut from its history, from its historical context. I tried to listen to it. Tell me your history, tell me who you are, where are you coming from? But I couldn't hear it, because this museum only functions with the audiovisual guide. When the visitor enters the museum, the visitors have the possibility to choose their own language. And then this language, this our voice, is guiding them through the museum. And this is when you go through this, when you pass this exhibition, then it is like as if seeing a 3D, a three-dimensional film, a cinema, without having the three-dimensional glasses. It is blurred without this guiding voice. So there I realized that when museums, they should come back to their original purpose. They should focus on their collections, to come back to collections, because those objects, they have really their history.
Mm-hmm. This brings us. You speak about the European Union and this Museum of the History of Europe. The report strongly critiques the role of the European Union in shaping museum practices, particularly in terms of funding and ideological agendas. How should we view the relationship between EU policies and museum practices? Are they a form of cultural imperialism? Or is there a legitimate role for institutions to guide cultural and historical understanding?
This question is a complementary question to the ICOM's role, because the problem is that museums are now mainstreamed centrally. They are very strong central institutions, like the ICOM is for the conceptual part, for the museum definition, the accents in the exhibitions. And the problem is that the EU is a very, very strong player in funding museums. And who is the giver of the money has also some words about how exhibitions and museums should work. So this is a major problem that those museum professionals, curators, who wants to make a great exhibition, they are dependent from the EU's funding. So somehow we should come back to the old model of patrons, who spend money for museums, who finance some exhibitions, so that it would give more variety and more freedom in exhibiting, in curating ideas.
The implementation of digital technologies, AI tech, apps, interactive exhibitions, games, they go a lot towards making museums more accessible. Some people would argue that, in this day and age, we need all of these bells and whistles in order for people to feel fully part of what's going on in the exhibit. But you point out that something that seems like a good can actually pose dangers. And particularly, you use the example of the Anne Frank House. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, I'm very glad for this question, because the Anne Frank House is a mystery in my eyes. Just to say 2 sentences about the Anne Frank House, it is not a museum. It is actually the virtual retelling of the story of Anne Frank, whom we know. And the Anne Frank House has no collection, so there are no original objects, so everything is a remake, a digital remake of this story. And it makes also sense, because how should we do it? It opens a possibility for also young people to confront, to understand this story, young people who are not reading maybe so much. But when you visit the Anne Frank House, this whispering voice in your head is all the time there. And it is somehow tragical that the very dramatic history or story of this young girl who died in the Holocaust is used for political purposes. Because the Anne Frank House was restored a few years ago. It changed also the concept of the museum. And they renewed it in a way that Anne Frank is used as a contemporary hero, a freedom fighter. You could compare her even with Che Guevara, or Nelson Mandela. And she is the voice for all kind of suppressed groups now in society. She is speaking not just against anti-Semitism, but she's speaking against Islamophobia. She's speaking for LGBTQ rights, the Black Lives Matter movement. So it is really, in a way, a very cynical misuse of this voice, of this story. And I also think sometimes, even it maybe sounds harsh, let this girl die. Let her be in peace. She does deserves it. She doesn't need to live eternally. And on this digital way, you just make her, she's there for an eternity, and she will be used maybe in 10 years, in 15 years for other purposes. This is indecent.
Mm-hmm. I very much hear what you're saying. It's as though you take a historical figure, take them out of their context and out of the actual situation that they lived and died through, and you put them to work for issues that are of concern to contemporary elites today. And that's rather shocking to see such a development take place. Can I ask you, who knows the hearts of men? You could answer, but the people who are perpetrating this change in the way museums are telling stories and the stories that they are telling and the propaganda that they're putting forward, is this done, do you think, through a good intention that we want the world to be a better place? Or is there, a manipulative aspect to it that he who controls the past, can shape the present? Do you think that there's a more sinister feeling to what's going on? Or do you think it's basically the road to hell is paved with good intention?
You see, I wouldn't look for the absolute evil, Mm-hmm. I think it is both. But this is symptomatic that museology is dominated by women today. And women are more emotionally maybe constituted, they want to care, they want to change the world. So if you see the most known representatives of today's museology, they are women. And it brings me back again to a concrete example. I lived in Denmark for long years. And 20 years ago, I was employed in a very specific kind of cultural history museum, the Women's Museum. Mm-hmm. There are only 3 women's museums in the world. It is one in Aarhus in Denmark, one in China, and one in Bonn in Germany. And it was a museum about the history of feminism in Denmark, about the fight for equal rights between men and women. And 6-7 years ago, the museum was overtaken by a new leadership. And this new leadership brought in the progressive ideas into the museum and changed the Women's Museum to a gender museum. And it is partially a response on your questions. Is it an evil, purely ideological intention, or there is also something, wanting to help discriminated groups, LGBTQ groups, but it is a combination of two. But now I intend to say that this is a kind of selling your soul, and you approach the devil, the evil, because the museum has a very sensitive task, and we're coming back to women's again, to care for society, education. This museum is just connected to schools, and classes are streaming through the museum, and they are brainwashed. Those young people, also children, really from the age of 7 years. And the museum made its first scandal by stilling up a huge statue of a naked breastfeeding man in this aula. So when people enter the museum, when youth enter the museum, the first this provocation or progressive idea they see, there is no difference between men and women biologically either. So this is not just equality between men.
It's not being a woman's museum, and it makes no difference whether what the ideological intention was. You're suggesting that the effect, the actual product, is bad.
And it is true, and in the old time, when it was still the Women's Museum, this museum did a lot for women with migration background, to help them, to consult them. Now they dropped this very important task, and Denmark has also a large Muslim community, so they would have so much work to do also. But they are turning towards the progressive woke ideology, and they're spreading really ideological gift through the society.
Gift? What do you mean by that?
They poison society with those ideas, with those woke ideas.
Mm-hmm. Things are looking bleak in the museum world when I read this report, and the trajectory that we've been on the last few years is away from the traditional museum could really damage our possibility of having this space as being one that would enhance our civilization. You suggest some things that could be done, action that could be taken. You propose a manifesto for the future. Can you tell us a little bit about how we could rescue the situation that haunts us today?
Well, I wouldn't use the word rescue, because I never saw Maya as a hero. And that's why also we used in the title the expression Renaissance. Renaissance, this is something, a renewal. But I never think in revolutionary terms. So I don't think that everything is evil. From the modernization, for example, of using digital technologies, multimedia technologies. We can learn of those from those technologies. They are important. But let's come back the first and most important point, and it is so easy. It is almost banal. Let's come back to the collections. Let's come back to the objects. Let's listen to them. Let's learn from them. So that should be the museum's core idea, and not the idea of making society better, of making society more human. This is not the museum's task. And we need also to be aware of that we are not Don Quixotes. You don't want to turn time back, because then they will show, no, as your place is not on this planet. You are not the daughter or the son of this time. Mm-hmm. But another point is also, beside the importance of the collections, that museums shouldn't directly engage with contemporary hot potato issues. Of course, they can't avoid them. They should have a stance towards them, but with a distance, and always through the methodology of museums and through a professional perspective. So if those are environmental issues, the issue of minorities, contemporary problems, they should be put into a broader perspective, as in history we use the longue durée. Mm-hmm. So we have the broader perspective, and always in a historical or a cultural context, it depends from the type of museum we are talking about. So it should give knowledge, contextual knowledge to the public. And maybe in the old type museums, museum always ask the questions: why it happened, what happened, and then they labeled the answers. Today museums they ask more how it happened, and I think we should come back to the why. Mm-hmm. That would be important.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I really would urge our listeners to read your report, Katalin. It's a very informative, very thought-provoking report. And you can find a link to the report at in the notes section of this podcast. Please do have a read and tell us what you think. This is John O'Brien signing off for MCC Brussels. Join us again for another version of Deep Dives.